From the nation's capital, Washington Debates for the 70s, a series of programs designed to bring together for an open exchange of views and opinions outstanding authorities on vital issues facing the world of the 70s. This is the first in the Town Hall series of discussions on national security. The topic, the Nixon Doctrine. Now, here is Peter Hackis.
Over the years, this country's foreign policy has changed with the times, reflecting the changing attitudes of our people and of our leaders. The Monroe Doctrine, for example, is one of the earliest I'm sure we all learned about as school children. In more recent times, it was the Truman Doctrine that guided U.S. foreign policy. Then there was the doctrine of massive retaliation during the Eisenhower administration. The Nixon years will be remembered for their own unique contribution to American foreign policy, a set of guidelines called the Nixon Doctrine. The imprint of Richard Nixon on U.S. foreign policy has been one of the key features of this administration. In essence, it marks the end of the post-World War II period, an end to the Cold War as a major factor in U.S. foreign policy, and the emergence of a new period of international negotiation to achieve this country's aims. Welcome to another program presented by the American Enterprise Institute, a nonprofit, nonpartisan research and education organization. Instead of our usual rational debate, this program will deviate a bit from that format to bring you the opinions of not two, but four experts in the field to discuss the pros and cons, as they see them, of the Nixon Doctrine and what it means to this country and to our worldwide neighbors. To present their views on the topic, the Nixon Doctrine from Despair to Opportunity, four prominent guests. Melvin Laird, Secretary of Defense for all of the Nixon years. Republican Senator Robert Griffin of Michigan, a close associate of Mr. Nixon, and the Assistant Minority Leader of the U.S. Senate. Democratic Senator Gale McGee of Wyoming, a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And Thomas Schelling, an international economist and professor at Harvard University. Also with us for our discussion, a panel of experts in the field, men and women engaged in making public policy, in teaching, and writing about the subject of the Nixon Doctrine. Now, to present our discussion, Robert Goralski, a Washington correspondent for NBC News. Mr. Goralski.
Throughout the long history of this country, Americans have prided themselves on an essential element in the democratic process, the need to debate policy and programs. It has, by consensus, strengthened the country. No aspect of American life is above debate. Today, there's perhaps nothing more important than our national security, how much to spend, in what way, and for what objectives. The issues are complex, but no one suggests they should not be debated. To accept military policy without debate would be as tragic as an administration trying to establish security programs without the support of the nation. That idea is held by the Secretary of Defense. Melvin Laird said in submitting his last budget request to Congress, "Without understanding of our national objectives and without support for the means we adopt to reach them, no strategy pursued by the representative leaders of a free and open society can possibly succeed for long when contested by a powerful, closed society. Free nations," he said, "must measure the ultimate strength of their defense policies in proportion to the willing support their citizens give to these policies. A closed society is not dependent on such popular support." Defense Secretary Laird came to Washington nearly 20 years ago. For all but the latter years, he was a member of the House of Representatives, serving on committees where his interests in national security, education, and health could be utilized to their fullest. He was appointed Secretary of Defense by President Nixon and has been the administration's perhaps most articulate and ardent supporter in the halls of Congress. It's a pleasure to introduce the Secretary of Defense, Melvin R. Laird.
Thank you very much, Mr. Goralski. It is delightful to have this opportunity to relax in the boardroom of the American Enterprise Institute with such ardent supporters as representatives of Yale, Harvard, the University of Chicago, the Brookings Institute, the press, and some members of the House and of the Senate. This evening we're going to discuss the Nixon Doctrine. The Nixon Doctrine and its meaning to America. I believe that it takes us from potential despair to new opportunities. The focus of my remarks will be this new doctrine which has been enunciated by our President starting in 1969 in Guam. It is an important statement of America's proper place in the world by a President who is concerned as much with shaping the future as he is with present needs. Designed to achieve a new era of long-lasting peace in international relations through partnership, strength, and a willingness to negotiate. The Nixon Doctrine combines high principle and practical realism. In these complicated times, the high hopes of the far-seeing statesman and the accomplished skills of the practical politician are both necessary for a successful policy that will lead to peace. With this basic idea in mind, I shall discuss briefly the Nixon Doctrine's principles, its practical results to date, and its promise for the future in terms of our new strategy of realistic deterrence. I believe it is most important that we have such public dialogues as this American Enterprise Institute affords us tonight to discuss the sweeping changes which are being made in foreign and in national security policy. We must avoid becoming mired in personal and parochial debates about the questions of how many aircraft carriers or how many aircraft wings or how many combat divisions the various services should have. Those are questions which are indeed important, but they are subsidiary to the broader national security issues that will decide America's future role and will impact on the world in which we live during the 1970s and beyond into the 1980s. The Nixon Doctrine, as it applies to foreign policy, was formulated in recognition of the fact that this world in which we live has changed. It has become too dangerous a place for great nuclear powers to constantly be in confrontation with each other. A most essential ingredient to a generation of peace is a stable relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union. There are and will continue to be profound differences between the Soviet Union and the United States, differences that cannot be simply ascribed to historical accident or to misunderstanding. We cannot eliminate these differences overnight, but we can make a start towards becoming peaceful adversaries instead of belligerent antagonists. We have broken with the principles of the past which said that America, because of some all-pervading wisdom, could in fact write all plans and dictate all programs. The Nixon Doctrine and its supporting national security strategy of realistic deterrence strike a balance between what America should do and what our friends can do. This doctrine permits us to do enough without doing or attempting to do too much. It pledges that we will keep our treaty commitments, that we will provide a nuclear shield, that we will assist our friends in safeguarding world stability, but it does not call upon us to do everything ourselves. The Nixon Doctrine and its supporting strategy relate to our relationship with the Soviet Union, but they do much more than just relate to this relationship with the Soviet Union. They provide the U.S. with a strategy that encompasses our relationships with all nations. As we move from confrontation to negotiation, from the symbols of force to the practices of persuasion, we must do so without submerging the national interests of any state, save the interests of waging aggressive war on others. We cannot neglect that national strength, so necessary to the process of negotiation and partnership, is a very important ingredient of this doctrine. Without it, negotiations soon become concessions and partnership becomes exploitation. The emergence and the development of the new realities of world politics will inevitably complicate the lives of every American. Some will despair, turning towards isolationism or outrage at America's apparent loss of world mastery, a mastery that is at least once a pretension of our country. Others, hopefully, the vast majority of Americans, will patiently absorb the new experience and learn to enjoy a larger measure of freedom in a fluid state of world affairs which can be provided to free men. The defense policy evolving from the Nixon Doctrine is evolving in freedom. It evolves from freedom from the rigidities of the Cold War and cannot be permitted to lead our nation or our people into a state of euphoria. We must continue to maintain our military strength and to cultivate that of our friends and of our allies. Indeed, there is a single characteristic that most distinguishes the Nixon Doctrine from other national security principles espoused since 1945. It is the emphasis we now place worldwide on the role of our partners and the role which they must play in the common defense under our new concept, which we refer to as the total force concept. The guidelines for our defense policy under the Nixon Doctrine and its strategy of realistic deterrence, a strategy aimed at deterring war at all levels of conflict, are as follows. In deterring strategic nuclear warfare, primary reliance will continue to be placed on the American strategic deterrent force. In deterring theater nuclear warfare, the United States also has primary responsibility, but certain of our allies are able to share this responsibility by virtue of their own nuclear capability. In deterring theater conventional warfare involving the USSR or the People's Republic of China, the United States and its allies share this responsibility. In deterring sub-theater or localized warfare where the United States is not involved directly with the Soviet Union or the People's Republic of China, the country or ally threatened bears the primary burden, particularly for its manpower requirements. I believe that many critics who argue the path we have chosen is nothing more than the previous road with less capabilities miss the main point. Over time, we should no longer need the past level of capabilities, provided that we can move forward with programs such as security assistance and burden sharing that put teeth into effective partnership with our allies. But patience on the part of the American public is required in order to make these plans materialize. Patience during delicate negotiations, patience with our partners, and patience to maintain adequate strength as we exercise our statecraft prudently and practically to achieve the goal of lasting peace. The practical results of the Nixon Doctrine, I think, we have but to turn to Vietnam. A real tragedy of Vietnam is that Vietnamization did not start before 1969. In January of 1969, the United States was bogged down in a Vietnam War to such an extent that our government appeared to be able to handle little else. Our efforts over the past several years have led us away from this obsession and toward a broader view of the world and our responsibilities in that world. While the change may not have been as dramatic as some would like, Vietnam has been to a considerable extent de-emphasized as American ground forces have been withdrawn. And today, the last American ground force with a combat role was withdrawn from Vietnam. 11 divisions were present in Vietnam in 1968. Today, not a single American division is present. Vietnamization, which is the policy of enabling the South Vietnamese to defend themselves against North Vietnam as well as against internal security threats, is producing substantial dividends. Considering that we started this program only in early 1969 after years of benevolent paternalism in Indochina. Patience will be necessary, however, if we are to see this program through to its successful completion in the ground, air, logistics, and in other areas as the complete and total responsibility is turned over to South Vietnam. After a careful reassessment of American policy in major areas of foreign affairs outside of Indochina, new efforts were launched during 1969 and in 1970 to bring peace in the Middle East, to move the Berlin question towards a satisfactory settlement, to formulate American positions for SALT, and to expedite our unfinished negotiations towards completion. In the areas of Berlin, SALT, bilateral relations with China and Russia, as well as various other negotiations, 1972 has proven a vintage year for American world leadership towards peace. On the major American initiatives inaugurated early in the Nixon administration, the Middle East remains an outstanding issue, but one should not neglect to note that the warfare was escalating in the Middle East when an American-sponsored ceasefire was accepted by the combatants in 1970, and this ceasefire has been maintained ever since. The ABM Treaty and the interim agreement to limit offensive weapons that have been produced in SALT I and are now before the Congress should be viewed as politically and militarily important for both limiting the strength and for maintaining strength. Perhaps there is no area of national security interest that has more carefully combined the negotiations and strength aspects of the Nixon Doctrine than SALT, just as no area of our policy better typifies the partnership facet of this same doctrine as it applies to Vietnamization. The SALT I agreements can pay a handsome security dividend to the United States by reducing the danger inherent in an uncontrolled race for nuclear arms. At the same time, it should be observed in all candor that the results of SALT I do not justify the kind of euphoria we are already encountering from some of those who contemplate substantial cuts in the defense budget for strategic arms. These agreements are a first step. They are but a beginning, not a culmination. At this point in time, therefore, we should proceed prudently and unprovocatively to develop whatever military programs are necessary to preserve our deterrent. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe the great promise of the Nixon Doctrine lies in the future. It provides us with a practical framework for the pursuit of high principles. It does not provide us all the answers which must be sought patiently and realistically in our interreaction with other members of the complex international world that exists today. We must use the opportunities we have to seek these answers, not by turning away from the problems because they are difficult problems, but by understanding the principles and adapting the realities to move forward on the path towards peace. For me, the Nixon Doctrine truly represents a turning away from the past discouragement and towards future hope. We have taken the first steps towards setting a new path, both domestically as well as in our international relations. That path is a long one that cannot be completed by anyone now in office, but the way has been set. Only the will of the American people and the wisdom and fortitude of their leaders in the years to come can realize the promise of our new course. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for that opening statement on the Nixon Doctrine. You've covered a broad area, you raised many points, and perhaps raised many questions. We'll have additional comments on the Nixon Doctrine from tonight's discussants, Senators Gale, McGee, and Robert Griffin, and Professor Thomas Schelling. Senator Gale McGee is politician, scholar, and teacher. He came to the U.S. Senate from the University of Wyoming, whose state he has represented in the upper chamber since 1958. He has served on key committees, including the Foreign Relations Panel. He has written extensively on the international scene and brings the view of educator and legislator to our discussion today. For his comments on the Nixon Doctrine, may I present Senator Gale McGee.
Thank you, Robert. I'd like to cast the Nixon Doctrine in the perspective of our being today. First, with the simple reminder that we got where we are today largely by the force of the events of World War II that placed us for the first time in our history on the front line of the world without a shield, that placed us on one side among two without our freedom of choice. And it's in that new, rather foreign role to us that we've been seeking since to live up to what we loosely call the responsibilities of world power. And I submit that the history of our time will show that we've done surprisingly well in spite of mistakes, in spite of hesitancy and uncertainties and major doubts. But what brings us here on this occasion is the disintegration here at home of any sense of confidence in our policy leadership or attempts. And it's into that setting that the Nixon Doctrine has been projected, because it addresses itself to the disappearance, for example, of that remarkable consensus that sustained American leadership policies for so many years after World War II. A consensus that was led largely by the old elite concept in foreign policies of most sovereign nations of the good old days. It was led by the executive in most instances, an executive that now is viewed with great distrust. I mean not a particular executive, but the office of the President of the United States. And it's looked upon with frowns by an increasingly distrusting public that either does not know or does not believe or does not agree with the directions of the United States in foreign policy. And so the Nixon Doctrine arrived on the scene as an attempt to try to win us a little more time. I think if we strain the doctrine so much as to believe it's the wave of the future, that we do ourselves a disservice. But it's won us an important segment of time. It's turned around some considerable element of public distrust and doubt for the moment. This means that we still have a chance to readdress ourselves to the requirements of world leadership in a world that's not essentially different in most of its basic ways than the world of Adolf Hitler or the world of Bill the Kaiser. Oh, I'm aware of all of the great refinements and the revolution of great expectations, but not in the relations among nations. The world is still the prisoner, in effect, of the balance of power. Perhaps, until now at least, the only substitute for war that so-called civilized man has yet come up with. And it's into that setting that we have to project the doctrine itself. In winning us time, it gives us a chance to sort through the unraveling of many of our historic processes here at home, to see if we can re-knit it all into a fabric that will sustain an American position of leadership in a sorely troubled world. The doctrine has a limitation, as I see it, and that is a part of its initial popularity or acceptance drew heavily upon groups that don't really believe in the concept that the world is here to stay. And I speak of those very conservative groups who would retreat to Fortress America without hesitation, and indeed are those now speaking out against President Nixon's approach. And I would remind each of us here that this moment in our history, when we may be realizing a chance for a second breath in this great testing time, that our opportunity is suspended by the tiniest of threads in one-man diplomacy. It's been brilliant diplomacy, and for the most part it's been very effective. But I submit that in our concept of free societies as they are taking their forms and their expressions now, I, for one, have reason to doubt that under those terms that our country can really rise to the responsibilities of world power in a world that still is made up of nation states not under law among the nations. Which brings me back then to the opening thesis, that we're still confronted with the necessities of balancing force, of an equilibrium of capabilities, of what other nice phrases we'd like to introduce to avoid the no-no, the balance of power. The balance of power is still here. We have almost put ourselves out of the ballpark in our capabilities of coping with the requirements of such a balanced system. But lest we be precipitous in dismissing the balance of power as a part of the real world, I think we ought to remind ourselves that until this moment at least, the Soviets are not quite yet the victims of the same domestic disintegration as are we. In their monolithic structure, they still have the advantage of an elite, of decision-making at the top, and of the relative absence of a fragmentizing of the opinion factor at home. Now, one may argue about each one of those attributes, but the point remains that they aid and abet your odds, favorable odds, in pursuing a successful balanced system. And so this leaves me with the conclusion that our real problem is less Soviet intentions or the Soviet Union in the world around us, as much as it is our coming to grips with our own domestic innards. These indeed call into question whether we can command a sense of responsibility in leadership in the future. I feel we must command that somehow we have to rise to it. But it means we have to go much further than we have dared to go until now. And that's why I would urge, and have continually urged, the appointment by the President of a prestige commission to totally re-examine the mechanisms of our system of constitutional freedoms against the requirements of the real world. And I would even go so far as to commission these members is to start with now, not with the founding fathers, not with the Constitution, but in the here and now, assuming that they're drafting the first Constitution for a republic which for the first time in its history has the task of rising to the needs of a world that's far from peace. There are many embellishments to be added to that formula, but it's sufficient to say that we kid only ourselves if we're going to pretend to survive in a world in which the balance of power, the equilibrium of capabilities, is not realized first.
Secretary Laird, I'd like
Could I have you identify yourself, please?
Yes, William Beecher, New York Times. Secretary Laird, I'd like to ask you a question about the implications of the Nixon Doctrine as it relates to our Indochina policy into the years ahead. You have pronounced Vietnamization, if not a roaring success, at least a success. My impression is that the Vietnamization process was not designed to contend with the kind of massive tank artillery supported attack from the north as we have witnessed over the last several months. My question then is this, sir. If negotiations fail to end the war, would you assume that a massive American air, sea armada must be kept for some years in Indochina, one, to deter a repetition of the kind of invasion from the north as we have recently seen, and two, if that deterrence fails, to help throw it back?
No, I do not.
Would you amplify that?
The Phase 2 of the Vietnamization program is going forward as outlined in the defense report, which turns over to the South Vietnamese the capability in the air, artillery, and logistics field to maintain their own in-country security against the threat of the North Vietnamese as they maraud throughout South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. We are effectively planning a force structure which will give them the capability of meeting this threat.
As of when, sir?
The program, as far as the ground responsibility, has moved much more rapidly than the air and the artillery and logistics. But even today, the South Vietnamese flew over 230 sorties, air sorties. They were flying a very few sorties when the program started. As a matter of fact, there were only 200 aircraft in the South Vietnamese Air Force. Today, there are well over 1,100. That program is moving along very well, and the program of Vietnamization does give the South Vietnamese the capability of defending their own in-country security. And that's what that program is all about, to terminate completely and totally American involvement in Indochina. Now, that does not mean that the United States will not have a presence in Asia as far as naval power and air power is concerned in the foreseeable future, because we will have such air power and sea power present in Asia during the foreseeable future as we apply the Nixon Doctrine and make the best use of the resources that are available with all of the countries with whom we have defense alliances and defense arrangements.
Your question is, sir?
Morton KAPLAN, University of Chicago. I'd like to return to the question Professor Schelling raised and ask Secretary Laird a question. But first, as an academic, I'd like to get the analogies straight. Professor Schelling spoke about abandoning Vietnam as we abandoned Taiwan. Now, the case of abandoning Vietnam means pulling out all military support, our defense commitment. There has, in fact, been a major change of policy in Vietnam as there was with respect to Taiwan. Vietnamization is a major change from the policies of the Kennedy-Johnson administration. Now, Professor Schelling is recommending that we do in Vietnam what we did not do with respect to Taiwan, namely remove our defense commitment. Immediately after the visit to China, there were some in Asia and elsewhere who felt that the policy was in fact the policy of abandonment of the defense commitment, and Marshal Green was sent to Asia to respond to that. Was there not a loss of credibility until the policy was adequately explained?
Well, I think that the trip of Marshal Green, Assistant Secretary of State Marshal Green, was an important trip. It is always well to have the opportunity to brief one's allies and friends regarding the discussions that take place, whether they be in Moscow, whether they be in NATO, whether they be in the People's Republic of China. But I do feel that there is a good comprehension on the part of our Asian allies of the Nixon Doctrine. They see Vietnamization as the first application of that doctrine. They see the program in Cambodia, where we made a conscious decision in this administration not to commit American ground forces to go forward with a military assistance program in that country. There were some that said we couldn't go to the Congress and get that approved. I was one that felt the Congress would approve an adequate military assistance program in keeping with the application of the Nixon Doctrine. We had a better than a 2/3 vote in the United States Senate for the application of that military assistance program in Cambodia, and we had a better than an 80% vote in the House of Representatives. No, I believe that this doctrine is being understood by our friends in Asia, and I know it is understood by our friends in Europe at the present time, having just returned from the NATO defense ministers' meetings.
Sir, you have a question?
Congressman ZABLOCKI, Wisconsin, 4th District. Secretary Laird, I'm somewhat concerned with your optimism of the success of the Nixon Doctrine. After all, regardless of what the label, any doctrine will have to stand the test of time. And the key as to whether the Nixon Doctrine will be a success is, if I may quote you, what the United States can do, friends will do. Now, Secretary Laird, you do know that in the past, a bipartisan spirit in the Congress, in the Senate and the House, made it possible for the foundation, which made it possible for the Nixon Doctrine to be built on. And I recall that some of the members of the opposite party of mine, your own party, consistently...
I'm non-political now.
I understand. But at that time, Mr. Secretary, you remember the House and you were political. But the military and economic assistance programs were opposed by the members of your party. And I'm not so sure whether they were consistently opposed, but to a great degree, to the very programs that made it possible for the Nixon Doctrine. My question is, what can the United States really do in the future, to the extent it has in the past, with the growing neo-isolationism in this country, the concern of our own economic ability to continue the economic and military assistance, and furthermore the division, and particularly in the other body in the Senate, in opposition to the military. And just recently you have very articulately convinced the House members how important it is to have military assistance. Is it not true we will have to have a bipartisan spirit, and we must have also a very viable economy in order to continue the Nixon Doctrine toward future successes?
There's no question about it, and the Nixon Doctrine will require that all of our friends and allies that are part of our partnership arrangement must make an increased contribution of their own assets and of their own resources to the military strength of their countries. We have these defense arrangements with Japan, with European nations through NATO. Some nations are not adequately contributing of their resources to the security of their particular areas. These mutual defense agreements which we have require mutuality on both sides. And those nations that are contributing less than 1% of their gross national product to defense and security requirements in their areas of the world and getting a free ride, we should discuss that openly and frankly with them, with our people, and with their people. Because the Nixon Doctrine, in order to succeed, must recognize this mutuality with our partners with whom we have these defense agreements and arrangements. Some of them can help in the security assistance area, military assistance area, some in the economic development area. Many of them are not sharing the burden adequately or effectively at the present time.
And if they don't, Mr. Secretary, excuse me, go ahead.
I think you will have to, in order to have the Nixon doctrine succeed, get continued and broader support on the part of the Republicans in Congress.
There is no question about the kind of support we need for our defense arrangements. It must be a bipartisan support, and that's why we are working both in the State Department and the Defense Department to build up and to develop bipartisan support for these programs.
What happened,
I do not
Secretary?
believe the defense issue should be the major issue in this campaign. I can assure you that President Nixon will continue to speak for a strong country. There are some in this year 1972 that don't believe strength is important. And I, as Secretary of Defense, cannot go along with that kind of a philosophy. And I do not criticize those people for running up the white flag now because they're Democrats or Republicans. I criticize them as Secretary of Defense and because I think that that's bad for America.
Just the question that follows in the wake of Clem's line of questioning. What happens if these partners don't produce, don't come through? Where does this leave us with the doctrine?
I believe they will come through
That's not the
if
question.
we are willing to talk frankly and openly with them. The problem has been in the past that we hesitate to talk in this frank and open fashion about the responsibilities all of us have in these partnerships. We look at these treaty commitments as one-way streets and forget to consider the mutuality of both partners to these defense arrangements. And I have found, since I've been talking with the defense ministers in NATO and with the NATO Council, that we have been able to move them in a different direction by talking frankly and openly with them. For the first time, we have the Defense Improvement Account which has been set up, and there are no U.S. contributions to this new program. We have been able to make some progress as far as Japan is concerned in some increases, not enough, but they are moving in a direction of increasing their defense program, not as much as they should. But this defense arrangement we have with Japan is a mutual defense arrangement, and it's about time we talked about the mutuality of these defense agreements that we have.
And if
I
they
believe
don't?
we can be successful.
And if they
by
don't,
talking
Mr. Secretary?
frankly and openly. If they do not, then I believe that the kind of bipartisan support which is needed and necessary from our Congress will not be maintained in the decade of the 1980s and in the latter part of the 1970s.
Question back here.
Yes. Bruce Russett from Yale University. I'd like to put a little different twist on this discussion. Professor Schelling and other people have noted that the idea of burden sharing, of persuading our allies to do more, has been around for a long time, and we've been only modestly successful in persuading our allies to do more. Perhaps a little bit more successful recently than in the past. One of the reasons, I think, that that success has been so modest has been that it's been very clear, both to Americans, to the American government, and to foreign governments, that there was a great deal of deep, broad, bipartisan support in the American populace for American military commitments abroad. Now, we've heard Senator McGee and others worrying about the growth of a new isolationism, the growth of Fortress America foreign policy ideas. To put that a little bit less pejoratively, at least a lessening of enthusiasm, rather broadly, in the populace for these military commitments. And that's true, too. The evidence, both in the past commitment, the level of these, and the really major change in American public opinion against these commitments is very clear. Now, of course, this can be very dangerous, this decline in support. On the other hand, I wonder if this doesn't perhaps provide an opportunity, that the fact that some of this support is much less than it used to be may make it possible for the Nixon administration succeed in persuading our allies to do burden sharing, to succeed in a way that previous administrations could not, because the popular political opinion in the country was quite different. So I wonder if perhaps even within the limits, of course, the present administration might not even welcome that change in public opinion.
I think you wanted the Secretary to respond, or...
Anyone?
Well, I would not want to state that that change is a welcome change. I can only state that as I meet with my colleagues, the defense ministers of these other alliances, and with our defense ministers from NATO and Korea and Japan, I think it's important that we point out the realities of the 1970s, and one of them is the political reality, the other is the fiscal reality which we faced during this particular period, and I do not hesitate to point those realities out.
You had a question here, sir?
Yes, it's William Kintner, the Foreign Policy Research Institute. The SALT agreement codifies a type of parity in the strategic field between ourselves and the Soviet Union. It also suggests a decoupling of our strategic guarantee to our allies, particularly into Western Europe. The statement has been made by many analysts, both in the United States and in Western Europe. And yet the necessity for regional equilibrium becomes all the more important. The European allies have been dragging their feet. I know some defense ministers probably would like to do more, but it's not also the problem that under the flexible response doctrine, which relies almost initially on conventional forces, they see no utility in building up their forces. Is there a possibility that the administration will consider giving greater weight to the nuclear defenses of Western Europe and perhaps assistance to the development of a European consortium based on the British and French nuclear deterrent to compensate for the reduction of our commitment, which will take place over time as a result of the SALT talks?
No, I would not think so. I think that we will be going in the opposite direction, and as we make progress in the strategic arms limitation field, and as we go forward with the follow-on negotiations as far as forward-based systems are concerned, that the importance of the conventional deterrent in Europe takes on an increased importance rather than a decreased importance. So I would think that quite the opposite line of reasoning would be used as far as our European allies are concerned. And I believe that we will be able to work out these arrangements and reductions over the next few years. The situation is such that we are only moving now in the strategic arms limitation area as far as strategic weapons. We will now move into the forward-based systems and to mutual and balanced force reductions and force limitations. Then we will be moving forward in the negotiation area on the whole broad question of military assistance and the levels of military assistance as far as the Far East, the Middle East, and other areas of the world.
Is there a question here?
ALTON, FRYE, WOODROW, Wilson, International Center. Mr. Secretary, the President has asked the Congress to act upon the SALT agreements before September 1st in order to facilitate a resumption in October of those follow-on negotiations. Some of your comments suggest that you might prefer a delay in action on those agreements until after Congress has considered the specific defense programs in the annual defense authorization. Someone commenting in the White House discussions of these agreements said the real question is not whether we can trust the Russians, but whether we can trust ourselves to act prudently on these follow-on defense programs in ways which both protect our national interest and spur the negotiations. Are you, in fact, of the view that the action by the Congress on the agreements should be delayed until after the defense programs have been approved, or would you be happy to see prompt action on SALT followed by prudent later decisions by the Congress on the individual defense programs?
Well, I believe that all three of the programs to which you refer, the 1973 budget request of the President's, the offensive agreement limiting offensive weapons as to numbers, ICBMs and submarines, and the treaty on the ABM limitation, all must be approved. I support all three. I do believe that they are a triple play for peace, and in order to be safe, you've got to touch all three bases. The Congress, in its wisdom, is moving first on the authorization legislation, and the House Committee has reported out the authorization bill, which will be acted by the House of Representatives next week. So the authorization bill is moving first. And I believe that your question is a rather iffy question because the Congress, in its wisdom, has decided to move on the authorization bill first.
Senator McGee?
Might I add just my point of view from the Senate, Mr. Secretary, that I think that it may be contributing to a psychological complication by stressing too strongly that if we don't get the one, you're not sure that we can go along with, let's say, the SALT agreement. I think you're going to get both. That's my judgment. And I think you ought to have both. And I agree with you completely that if we don't follow up with the requirements of what is legal under the treaty for keeping our force updated and modernized, that we prejudice the chances for the second stage. But the point is that by tying the two together so inseparably, I think you're almost automatically setting up a wall of opposition that we need not have to climb over. I think it's important that we ratify SALT and then that we meet head-on the defense requirements to protect our posture. I think your track record, the track record of this administration in leading from real capabilities is so strong that that's a risk we have to take. I just don't think we need to complicate our problems in the Senate. I guess you should be making the speech, Bob, with the suggestion that they have to go, that they're inseparable. I agree that they are. I just don't think you ought to be saying so quite so articulately as you are.
Well, I do not control all of the questions that are asked of me, but my support of the ABM Treaty and the support which I have indicated for the follow-on agreement as far as offensive weapons is based on the approval of the 1973 program in which we go forward during this period, this next 5 years, with these strategic systems. And when I'm asked a question, I will answer it. And if members of the Senate or others do not want me to answer questions frankly and openly, then they better find somebody else to serve as Secretary of Defense, because that's the way I will answer those questions when asked by any member of the press or a member of the House or the United States.
All you need to say, Mr. Secretary, is let's cross one bridge at a time. Let's get the SALT Treaty ratified. Then we must address ourselves to what the SALT Treaty requires of us, and let's get to it. That's all.
Well, the authorization bill on the 73 defense budget is moving first, and I'm happy that it is.
Question here.
Bill Anderson, Chicago Tribune. I'd like to continue, Mr. Secretary, on Mr. Beecher's point about the military situation in South Vietnam. Could you give us an assessment of the potential military offensive capabilities of North Vietnam today as compared with some recent other period of time in front of the invasion of South Vietnam? Is their capability as strong today? Is it much weaker? And how does this tie with your own buildup of South Vietnamese forces?
Well, as far as my assessment of the capabilities of the North Vietnamese, they haven't changed since the assessment I made in November. I believe the North Vietnamese had the capability that they had developed it in November to stage 3 or 4 major spectaculars in South Vietnam. Thus far, they have staged 1 successful spectacular. They have taken over Quang Tri province, one of the 44 provinces of South Vietnam, they have the capability, I think, to stage another spectacular. They were not successful in the spectacular they attempted at An Loc or at Kon Tum, but I do believe they have the capabilities to go forward with one more spectacular within the next 30 days. I believe then that they will fall back and will not hit again until sometime in September or October. Their capabilities in September and October will not be as strong as the capabilities which they possessed during the last 2 months. Now, this is assuming that we do not have a negotiated settlement. They will have that military capability during this period.
Max Singer, Hudson Institute. I have long been an admiring student of Professor Schelling, but he seemed to be applying tonight a lesson of history that I had not yet learned when he blamed President Nixon for not having achieved a satisfactory peace in Vietnam. It's my impression that we may face a war in the Middle East that goes on for another generation or even another century. And the reason is that we have some people in one territory that want to throw out the government of another territory, and the people in that territory don't want to have their government thrown out. And as long as that pair of conditions last, war in the Middle East may last. It seems to me that pair of conditions may last a while in Vietnam, and that it is not in President Nixon's control to stop it, and so it is not in his power to bring peace. Professor Schelling made an analogy between, or suggested an analogy between what he suggested was a betrayal of Taiwan, and said that we didn't lose credibility. I would suggest that the reason we have not lost credibility about what has happened in Taiwan is that Chiang Kai-shek is alive and healthy and his people are prospering, partly because of 200 miles of water and partly because of effective defense forces. I think that the analogy to Vietnam is partly correct. So long as you do not have people hanging from communist lampposts for the crime of being American allies, we will not lose credibility. But if either Taiwan suffers a tremendous loss in their position, not just their diplomatic unhappiness, but something substantial, or in Vietnam, then there will be a different problem. The costs of Vietnam have been immense, the benefits have been substantial, but let me suggest that both the costs and the benefits, the final score is not yet written, and that there's a lot of variation depending on what happens in the next few years, and therefore our policy has a great deal yet to play for.
You want to respond to that, Professor Schelling?
Yeah, Chiang Kai-shek has prospered because of a lot of water, a lot of money, and no political opposition. I don't know what the analogy is with Vietnam. My question is simply, how long? And for how long do we go on pretending that we care about the South Vietnamese and not about the North Vietnamese, on whom it is our official position a regime was imposed by force, and for whom, as people, we have no particular antipathy? There must be some length of time, Mr. Singer, over which this will not have been worthwhile, even for the South Vietnamese, especially if we can take heart from the Nixon doctrine that things can even get better on the communist side of the world, and we can learn not only to live in peace with them, but to trade with them, and to expect less obnoxious forms of life than for 20 years we insisted were inevitable. It's hard to say at the moment whether the South Vietnamese would be better off or worse off if we abandoned them. What bothers me is that I thought when President Nixon came in, he promised something shorter, more progress than we've seen. If the best we can hope for is that the South Vietnamese will be able to fight their own war in perpetuity when we get out, then I'm not sure that the people on either side of the DMZ will thank us 10 years hence. They may wish that they were in the position of the Chinese, who after years of bitterness in the past are coming back into decent relations with the rest of the world. I just wonder how long we can claim that we are benefiting the South Vietnamese by supporting them in a bitter, bloody war, and whether what they're going to end up with is all that much better than in the areas that the Secretary has referred to as developing polycentric, less ideological, less rigid forms of government. I don't know. I'm just questioning where
the North Vietnamese, however, because it is the North Vietnamese that are marauding outside of their borders. It is not the South Vietnamese, it is not the Cambodians, it is not the Laotians. And I think that that's the important difference that we must recognize tonight.
I think we can go on discussing the Nixon Doctrine for a much longer period of time, but unfortunately we cannot. Thanks to you, Defense Secretary Melvin Laird, Senators Gale, McGee, Robert Griffin, and Professor Thomas Schelling from Harvard University. Thanks for being with us tonight in this town hall meeting of the American Enterprise Institute. Thank you and goodbye.
This discussion has brought you the views of 4 experts who have differing ideas on major items of public policy. It is the aim of the American Enterprise Institute to illuminate the issues by presenting many opposing ideas in the hope that by so doing, those in decision-making positions will benefit from a free exchange of informed and enlightened opinion. This is Peter Hackus in Washington.
Washington Debates for the 70s is created and supplied to this station as a public service by the American Enterprise Institute, Washington, D.C. Produced in the nation's capital by Broadcast News, Washington.